Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Tattoos with Intention podcast. Thanks for joining. I'm Taylor, part of the Tattoo Pathway team, and as something a little bit different, I'll be your host for today's episode. Before we get into today's conversation, if you find anything we discuss useful or you enjoy listening, please subscribe or share the episode across your social network to get the conversation out there. The Tattoos with Intention podcast has been scheduled for once a month as part of our efforts to share zero-cost information that is focused on giving you insights and tools to create more meaningful and substantial tattoo experiences. In this podcast, I had the privilege of interviewing Lane Wilcken. Lane is a scholar, cultural tattoo practitioner, and advocate for the critically endangered cultural practice commonly known as batok, or the cultural tattoos of the Philippines. Needless to say, Lane is an expert in Filipino tattoos and author of a number of books, including Filipino Tattoos, Ancient to Modern, which I've read and highly recommend. In our chat, Lane shares his journey into studying and practicing indigenous Filipino tattooing, sparked by his experiences in Hawaii and a strong process of initiation and responsibility. He discusses the deep cultural, spiritual, and historical significance of Filipino tattoos, which are linked to rituals, ancestral guidance, and social status. Lane emphasizes the importance of understanding one's heritage and the holistic approach to tattooing, contrasting it with modern commercial tattoo practices. He also highlights his efforts to revive and educate people about traditional Filipino tattooing and its potential health benefits, reiterating that meaningful tattoo experiences require cultural context and intentionality. So Lane and I ran into some tech issues midway through our conversation, so we're splitting this into a two-part series and we'll pick up where we left off in the next episode. I hope you enjoyed today's chat as much as I did. Maybe we could just start with you sharing a little bit about yourself and what you're currently doing within the tattooing space.
I started studying the indigenous tattooing of the Philippines in my early 20s after living in Hawaii for a while. I was very impressed by Polynesian culture, and knowing that I'm not Polynesian, I did not want to appropriate tattoos that were not mine, of course, and so I started by first asking my mom, did Filipinos ever tattoo? And she was very suspicious of me. Course, you know, she still had that stigma. Oh, tattoos are only for criminals. And so she said, oh, why? Are you planning on getting a tattoo? At the time, I was just doing some exploratory research. It really just questions at that time. And I said, no, not right now. I'm just wondering if we ever tattooed because there's tattoos in Hawaii. And I didn't tell her all of this, but I felt very drawn to things. I felt a kinship with Hawaiians and the Polynesians. I didn't know how to explain at the time. There wasn't any real research into those links between our cultures. There still isn't a lot of research done. One of the foibles of modern anthropology, I think, is kind of breaking down over the years, and people are taking a second look at it. But in the past, anthropology would tend to cubbyhole cultures and just portion them off. This is exclusive to this culture, etc. But what I did is I kind of approached everything like a linguist. I just started looking for things, looking for examples of from the Philippines. My mom said, yes, we do tattoo in the past, or only the Igorot people tattoo. And I asked her, I said, Mom, aren't we part Igorot? And she goes, yeah, but we really don't talk about that. Because at the time, the term Igorot used to be a derogatory. It's been reclaimed by the people of the Cordilleras of the Philippines. They have kept most of those ethnic groups up in the Cordillera of northern Luzon and the Philippines, kept their tattooing traditions into the 20th century. Then with the Americans moving in and missionization very quickly was lost and fell by the wayside, with only the Kalinga people keeping it into the 21st century. If you're not familiar with her Apu Huangod of Buscalan, she was at the time the only practitioner left in the early 2000s of their people, active tattooist, I would say. And she's known as a Mambabato, The mambabatok is a ritual tattooist. So it's not quite analogous to a tattoo artist. The mambabatok is a healer, is a divinator. They hold a very special place in society, a very high place in society, I would say. But she was the only active one. There were others, but they had not tattooed in many years. Yeah. So I went up and I saw her in 2010. But at this time, I wasn't tattooing. I was still doing research. I was trying to get my book published and out. And when I met Apo Huang Od, she lamented a little bit because at the time she wasn't sure if her grandniece or granddaughter, nuclear family terms are very different over there, but her granddaughter or her grandniece, Grace, was not sure if she was going to pick up the tools or not. She thought in 2010 that when she died, she was the last and that the practice would die. And it's one of the reasons my teacher, Suluwape Kione Nunes of Hawaii, and I went to see her. Kione wanted to reassure Huang Od that even though she might pass, and he told me that he's seen way too many elders with that sorrow go to the grave knowing that they were the last and that they would be lost when they died because no one was interested. He went there to reassure her that even though she might die and no one will follow in her footsteps, at least the tapping will be continued by the relatives, the cousins. The song of the tools will continue forward into the future. Maybe not quite in the same way, but I think that Huang Od really appreciated that. When we visited, Kione brought his tools. He tattooed one of our friends, Dr. Annalyn Salvador Amores, with designs that are found both in Kalinga, among the Kalinga people, and among Hawaiians. And we do share a lot of the same iconography throughout Austronesian-speaking peoples. In a broader sense, a lot of indigenous tattoos are formulated very similarly. She got really excited when she saw the patterns and saw him tapping. She went and got her tools out and she was showing them to him. And she got very excited. She says, I don't have anyone to tattoo. And one of our translators said to her, you can choose any of the men here, Apo. And she got all excited. Huang Od, she's a bit of a rascal. She asked to see my legs. And at the time, both of my thighs were tattooed. I didn't have a whole lot of tattoos, but both of my thighs were done. And she asked to see my legs, and she looked at my legs and remarked how they were powerful. The designs were powerful. And she asked me if I would like to be tattooed. Of course, I responded yes. A few minutes later, we're out in her front yard with the chickens and the pigs, and she tattooed a design up on my shoulder called a Ini Iliab. It's a fertility design. It worked because I had another kid after that, I guess. It was a very surreal experience for me in my journey. And even at that time, even though I stretched here and there for Kione, he was mainly my mentor through writing my book, The Time, before he was my teacher when it came to the tools and everything. I was excited to receive something from this obscure, at the time, obscure practitioner that was a remnant of this ancient tradition that used to fill our islands in the past. And for context, for those of you who are not Filipino, the original name that the Spaniards, our islands, was Las Islas de los Pintados, the islands of the painted people. And tattooing used to be abundant throughout our islands. And nowadays, the vast majority of Filipinos don't think that they had a tattooing past. We were colonized 223 years before Polynesia. So the damage to our indigenous cultures in the Philippines, especially in the lowland communities where we had a lot of contact, the damage to our cultures was extensive. And the practice was driven underground or made extinct among most ethnic groups. So even to this day, most Filipinos don't know, despite all of the work that I've done over the last decade and a half to advocate for tattooing. There's 120 plus million Filipinos in the world, and it's very hard to reach everybody. So I'm grateful that I'm able to come on podcasts like yours so that we can spread that education around and hopefully restore the practice in a way that is good, a way that is acceptable to our ancestors and does the best good for our people. And I think that, by example, a lot of other cultures and peoples throughout the world might look at what we're doing, learn from our mistakes, learn from our successes so that they can also restore their practices. I've tattooed people outside of the Filipino culture, like some of the Native American peoples have asked me to do their traditional markings because they don't have practitioners left and they don't want to receive it in a way that is with the machine.
Is there anything you'd like to add to that around what you're currently doing in the tattoo space?
So currently I am a tattoo practitioner, a cultural practitioner. I don't work in a tattoo shop. I do ritual tattooing. And so what that entails is that we do all the protocols that we know of from the past. Again, in the Philippines, among most of the ethnic groups, the practice has become extinct to the point that people don't even know that their ancestors were tattooed. They think it's just one particular ethnic group that kept it into the 20th century. So it's unfortunate that we've lost so much in the last few centuries. The Spaniards came to our islands in the early 1500s and did not give it up until the Americans took over in the early 20th century during the Spanish-American War, and then there was a Philippine-American War. And so we've had several different people colonize our islands, and the damage to our indigenous cultures is extensive to the point that some Filipinos don't consider themselves indigenous, if you can believe that. Even people living there on the island, speaking their own language, doing their own traditions from the land, they still dissociate from that connection that they have with their homeland. Especially for us that are diasporic Filipinos, we feel very disconnected from the culture a lot of the time. And so in the Filipino American community, people began asking me for traditional tattoos. I wasn't planning to tattoo. I wanted to receive. I didn't think I was adequately qualified to do the work. I'm mixed. My dad is an American of English and Scandinavian descent. I grew up in the States, so my language is not fluent. I'm conversational at best, but I didn't feel fully qualified to do this work for our people. But I recognized also, and not to sound aggrandizing or anything, but I started studying our indigenous tattooing when I was in my 20s, and now I'm in my 50s. I did 2 decades of research before I published Filipino Tattoos, Ancient to Modern. And even then, when I published the book, I didn't have any intentions of tattooing myself. My teacher, Suluwape Kione, he really shamed me into publishing the book. I almost didn't publish it. I didn't think anyone would be interested, for one. But I thought to myself, if I'm the only person that buys my book and reads it, then the journey will be worth it because I have learned who I am and who my people are. And so Kione, he shamed me into publishing it. He said, if this knowledge isn't common anymore. And to paraphrase him, he said, if you die, Lane, what's going to happen to all that knowledge? What's going to happen to all those elders that gave you knowledge? It'll be lost all over again. Someone will have to start from scratch. And me knowing that some of the elders I interviewed were very old, and some of them have passed since then. But if I didn't carry it forward, it would be lost again. So I'm grateful that he did shame me into publishing it. But then once it was published, I thought, okay, my responsibility is done. I've given some foundational knowledge to my people and world about our indigenous tattooing. And someone can carry the torch from there. And it says to me, now it's time to put into practice. I resisted that too. I didn't want to do it. I even tried to pawn it off on my good friend Virgil Apostle. He's actually a distant cousin of mine, and we were friends for many years. And his focus culturally was on our healing practices in the Philippines. And I thought, you're a natural. You're supposed to be a healer when you tattoo. He grew up partially in the Philippines. You speak fluently. But he said, no, I don't think it's for me. I think that's supposed to be you. Like, oh man, I cannot escape it. So I resisted it until my dad got cancer. And long story short, the oncologist wanted to tattoo his radiation targets on his body so he wouldn't have to do measurements every time. He didn't want somebody he didn't know tattooing him. So he asked me if I would do it. Then the terror of actually tattooing really distilled upon me. I made a very simple tool out of a wooden dowel and a lemon thorn from my mother's tree, and got some India ink. My brother John stretched my dad's skin for me, and we tattooed the radiation targets on my father. And he passed away a few months later, but that was my initiation, if you will, into the practice. I had told some friends in California about my experience tattooing my father, and it wasn't too long after that when he began asking me for to knowing that I have an uncommon body of knowledge, knowing that my teacher, my mentor wanted me to practice, knowing that I needed to carry it forward in a good way, and that there were others out there that were claiming to revive things, but were really continuing the bastardization of our practice, mixing designs with Polynesian designs. And sometimes we have the same motifs, but it's the size and placement or the orientation of the design that denotes what ethnic group it belongs to. So if you're not literate, it can get very confusing, and people will sometimes go to these tattoo artists in good faith to receive ancestral marks as they're claiming they're getting. And they get something that is, really aesthetically beautiful, but isn't from their particular ethnic group. And in our traditions in the Philippines, you're recognized by your tattoos, by your ancestors. Giving somebody incorrect designs and just taking their money, in effect, assigns you to the wrong ancestry. I've seen some of the compositions by tattoo artists, and sometimes they have designs from ethnic groups in that person's composition from tribes that they were formerly at war with, or enemy tribes. And so you'll get this hodgepodge of things. It's like trying to write a sentence with 5 different languages and you don't speak any of them. And knowing that was going on in our community, and people asking me and having all this information, and then tattooing my father, I relented and I began tattooing the community. But it was out of a sense of responsibility.
Yeah, you've touched on some really poignant points in your journey into tattooing. So something that really stood out to me was what you just mentioned around the responsibility piece. Like, you went from thorough research to have an understanding of what tattooing was and is in your cultural context. And then you had the personal experience of being tattooed, and I guess moving into it from a sense of responsibility, as opposed to, I think, in modern times where anybody can go into giving tattoos, and it's not often linked with a sense of responsibility or a client-centric approach. And it is linked in with the consumerism and the commercialism side of Western society, which I do want to get into a little bit later. But what you also shared is how important the cultural context is to tattooing and how it's not separate from that. And there was actually a line in your book that really stood out to me at the very start, where you said, an appreciation of the culture as a whole is necessary to comprehend the significance and context of tattoo designs and motifs. And why that really stood out to me was it was really speaking to how tattoos were connected to and embedded in everyday life and the spiritual reality. They weren't just this separate thing that you could just go get that wasn't connected to who you are and what you do. Or it just makes me think, wow, what would life look like if tattooing was approached like that across the board, and what would culture look like? But for our listeners, I was wondering if you could unpack that statement a little bit around how tattooing wasn't separate from the cultural context and how understanding one allowed you to understand the other.
Yeah. So my methodology had to adapt in my research because I recognized very early on, especially as a diasporic Filipino, that one, I didn't grow up in the Philippines. No, I had aspects of the culture that my mom brought with her when she came to the States. But the ancient culture where these designs came from, I needed to understand that if I had any hope of understanding the tattoos. What often happens is I'll see people grab a hold of my book, usually a tattoo artist. They'll lift designs from the pages, they'll turn them into Flash and strip it of all cultural context. So,
Right.
for example, I was at a tattoo convention and some Filipino tattoo artists approached me and they had the kinahu design, the dog tattoos on them. I was a little taken aback and why do you have the kinahu designs? And said, oh, because we raise pit bulls, we love pitties, and so we wanted to have dog tattoos. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, you read my book, but didn't read it, didn't
Mm.
understand it. And maybe they didn't even read it, they just lifted designs. But, that's kind of the approach that a lot of people do when they're doing research is they're looking for just the patterns.
Mhm.
And if you knew the significance of that dog tattoo, why have a dog tattooed on your body? Well, it's attached to a ritual. It's attached to headhunting. And the ritual is called the dalung rite. In the dalung ritual, they sacrifice dogs. And it happens when they bring back an enemy head. And they do a celebration. They celebrate not just the warrior, but they also celebrate the person who has been slain so that their soul will be at peace after the conflict is over. And then in the dalung ritual, they bind the soul of the fallen warrior to the person who had killed them so that they become companions through the rest of his life. The very different context than I like pit bulls.
Starkly different.
Yeah, you would receive the dog tattoos after honoring someone you had slain. So different context towards warfare, different context towards having a tattoo. And that's just one little example. So I had to jump into the ancient culture of the Philippines if I had any hope of understanding what these markings were really about. I wanted the depth. I didn't want to have something superficial on my body. I didn't want to just strut around and show off. I wanted to have something that really linked me deeply to my ancestry. And so navigating that, you have to study. You have to understand the culture that the tattoos came from. And a lot of people throughout the world had tattooing at one point in their culture, some form of body modification, or it could be scarification, paint, body, all kinds of things. But we marked ourselves in the past, and it wasn't something that was just purely for the aesthetic. Unfortunately, that's how the modern tattoo industry came into being, is people stripped the tattooing culture of all cultural context and just left the art behind. All the spirituality is erased. A lot of Europeans, when they came through our islands and through the Americas and they saw tattooing, of course, they were Christians, so they didn't want to take on any of our pagan beliefs or anything like that. So it got stripped. And unfortunately, it's just art now. And there's nothing wrong with having art on your body, in my opinion. Other practitioners might have different opinions, and I don't claim to speak for them. But I think there is room for both indigenous and cultural tattoos, as well as modern tattoo art. It's where people get the two mixed up, that just because I get the symbol on my body means that I have the full significance of a design. It's not like that. If you look at tattooing cultures around the world, this is very ritualized. There's prayers, there's often in our culture, there's offerings to the dead because the designs represent them. And in our culture, it's considered very rude to speak behind a person's back, right? In most places. And these designs are a visual language. And so if I tattoo something without that being present in one form or another, it might be the symbol of that ancestor or spirit. It could be something that they thought embodies them. But there has to be an invitation at the very least to that ancestor to come and participate so that they are not spoken of behind their back. How can you put something on your body if you don't even understand its full significance? And from what we've found in excavations in the Philippines, the practice, the oldest tattooing implements that have been discovered have been carbon dated at about 4,000 years old. So the practice is at least that old in the Philippines. That's just what we've discovered. Probably came with us when we left the Asian continent thousands of years ago, because the proposed point of Austronesian migration and consensus among most anthropologists is that we left southern China thousands of years ago. Genetic studies are pushing that date farther and farther back. But there are ethnic groups in southern China that tattoo. A lot of their designs are very similar to ours. So we probably brought the practice with us from Asia whenever that happened, whenever we actually migrated from the continent out to the islands. And then that spread throughout our islands. It spread throughout the rest of the Pacific into Indonesia and Micronesia, Melanesia, Polynesia. And there's evidence that we even had contact with the Americas anciently. So some of our food items, like our sweet potatoes, our gourds, those come from the Americas. We had contact there too. And so this is a very far-reaching culture, the Austronesian language family that spread throughout the whole of the Pacific and all the way to Madagascar. We inhabit the largest geographical area on the planet. And a lot of us trace our ancestry back to the very same people by name. So in our oral traditions and Polynesian oral traditions, we go back to the same ancestors by name. So I also looked at our sister cultures and our cousin cultures for context, because there was a lot of erasures in our memory, because it's been sanitized by the Spaniards and the Americans. A lot of our history has been sanitized or intentionally left out so that we don't have a knowledge of these things. So I had to look for cultural context. I collected a lot of fragments. I bought books and magazines. This is, when I was doing research, it was pre-internet. But I had to buy a lot of stuff. I spent thousands of dollars on just books alone, just to get fragments. To fill in the gaps, I looked at our cousins, or those that come from the same lineage. And so sometimes we're able to rebuild that. It's like everyone has pieces of the same puzzle. And by comparing all of our pieces, we can get a fuller understanding of what the practice was like, as well as from those that are still living, that still have a living practice. If people want to rediscover their roots, they're going to go deep. And all of us have roots. Eventually, you go far enough back, we all come from an indigenous background.
I think you said something that stood out to me just then, which was, how can you put something on your body if you don't understand it? And I almost feel that could be a bit of a slogan for how tattooing is currently approached in the mainstream tattoo culture. Because what I really received from reading your book was designs that you got on your body, and the placement of where tattoos went on your body weren't random, weren't even necessarily by individual choice. It was guided by ritual and protocol, like you said. And it was a marker that people could understand who you were through visual, in the sense of it marked maybe an achievement or transformation. It marked the community you were a part of. It granted passage to the afterlife. It had all of these meanings that were interwoven with the everyday life, but spiritual reality as well. And when I was reading that, it made me think, okay, well, how can we understand tattooing within the Western cultural context? You know, if you can use the cultural context to understand tattooing, what can I draw from that? And some of the things that I was coming to was there's the individualistic side of Western culture. And I see that in tattooing in the way that we don't have this shared understanding of why we get tattooed or what the meaning of tattoos are. And equally, we don't have that shared acknowledgement of each other when we do get tattooed to be like, yeah, wow, I can see what you've stepped into or what you're marking. I understand you. So we don't have that kind of collective community understanding of tattooing. We also have kind of the fragmentation. And I think, like you were saying earlier in the podcast, how anthropologists had looked in at culture as these like single exclusive things. I see how currently in the mainstream tattoo culture, it's separated out from the rest of life. So it doesn't always represent who you are or what you're doing, or it's not linked in with other modalities or ways of living. Then there's the kind of consumerist, capitalist component of Western culture that's echoed in tattooing in I want what I want whenever I want and I can get it. There's not that responsibility that you were talking about, even in your journey to moving into the tattoo space. I think as well, there really is a lack of guidance in tattooing now. I do believe that there are people in Western culture, and I would include myself in this, who thinks there is more to life and more to tattooing than what we've been prescribed through the mainstream Western tattoo culture. And there's not many places it feels like you can go to get the guidance to move into more, to have that protocol, to know that what you're being initiated into and the changes that you'll experience from being tattooed. And so I do think that tattooing as art, as just art, has become the main way that tattooing is approached. And we've touched on so far, you know, what initially stripped tattooing of that significance, the colonization and the erasure of culture. But I'm curious to hear from your perspective, what do you think is sustaining this idea that tattoos are just art?
I think you already hit that. It's the capitalism, commercialization of the practice. And I'm not saying that tattoo artists shouldn't be paid or anything like that. Don't get me wrong. In our islands, the tattoo practitioner was handsomely compensated to the point that people sometimes went into debt for it, like give their lands away, give their animals away, or promise that they will give something away later. And that's why it was a mark of status. You had to be able to be in a position to compensate the practitioner for the rituals that they were doing for you. And so carrying it forward, I think that's one of the obstacles, is that it has been stripped significance. It is largely individualistic. And that's one of the main differences between cultural tattooing and modern tattooing, is that modern tattooing, or the tattoo industry, is focused on individuality. It's focused on exclusivity, whereas cultural tattooing is inclusive. It shows who you belong to, who you're a part of. If there are personal designs on there, it's because of what you do for the community. So you can be marked as warrior, for example, but it's in that service to the community, not because you're just a badass. You know, I get a lot of fila that will approach me. They're mostly males. I've worked out, I've developed my body, I've trained in martial arts, I'm ready for my warrior tattoos. Well, I'm sorry, you're not a warrior. Have you killed me? No. Then you are not a warrior. You're not worthy of the designs. And even if you have killed people, and I've had ex-military come to me, even then, it's not the same context to receive a headhunter's tattoo, for example, what we call the jatrag. The jatrag was given to successful headhunters up north, and often people were shamed at doing it because the humility was prized of the warrior. This wasn't to show your bravado. It was to honor the person you had slain or people that you had slain. And because it was a painful process and because humility was encouraged, for example, you were not allowed to talk about your headhunting exploits except within a ritual context. You could not brag about it. Now, that is something individualistic that can be put on the body if you can even think of it that way. Or if you were a healer, you could be marked as a healer. But that's in service to the community. The headhunter is in service to the community. He doesn't just go out just for fun. It's because it is culturally significant to the community. One context for the headhunting is if somebody murders someone from your village, then we're going to balance the scales. It wasn't just done randomly, just so you could get. That wasn't it at all. You had done something in service of the community, and so you were given that. And part of the purpose of the jatrag was to assuage or to pacify the spirit of the dead person that had been slain, but also to address the PTSD of the who had taken human life. So it's a very different context. It's very inclusive versus exclusive. And so that's the biggest shift. And I think that's very hard for tattoo artists to do because they're brought up in this industry where it's very individualistic, where it's very exclusive. This is my art. This is my flash. They get upset when people copy it. And then the recipient as well. This is my art. This is mine. Cultural tattooing these are not my designs that I am doing. I am not trying to do my own flair or my own take on the designs. I don't have a lot of artistic license when I'm doing ritual tattooing. I'm trying to replicate what is proper and correct according to the old protocols. And I think the arrogance of Western culture is also something that inhibits learning from the past. We tend to think of ourselves as superior to our ancient ones. But they've been tattooing for thousands of years. They've explored the practice and its nuances for thousands of years. And it would be so arrogant to just, in the face of all that wisdom, think, well, I'm going to do my own thing. I know best. If I can give it a little example of this, in 2015, after the publication of my 2 books, I realized I had a chart of Chinese medicine, meridian lines, and acupuncture points. And I looked at that and all the meridian lines and acupuncture points, and I looked at one of the early depictions of our tattoos from the Boxer Codex. It's a Spanish document from the 1500s. And I realized that the tattoos follow the meridian lines and they go over specific parts of the body. So not only is there this symbolic and spiritual aspect to our tattooing, but it also is to enhance the overall health of an individual. Like with the Maori and the Mokokawai and even with the natives here in the States, they mark the chin of a woman. And that is the beginning of the conception vessel in Chinese medicine. It is to enhance. So I had to reassess a lot of what I was doing at the time, because here's some wisdom from the old ones. We're intentionally placing it over specific energetic points in the body to enhance the overall health of the body. My school and I have actually participated in a research study studying the immunological benefits of traditional tattooing. And they were looking at it from a Western standpoint, of course, of micro-infections that bolster the overall immune response of the body. But there's also this other aspect, this energetic aspect. And for people that may not know, humans, we produce a lot of different electromagnetic fields. That's what you measure with an EKG or with your heart, with an EEG in your brain. They're measuring the electrical activity. And so we have all these subtle fields of electromagnetic energy that can be interacted with. Acupuncture takes a little needle, which is electrically conductive, puts it over a spot in the body and affects an organ system. And they've been studying that for at least 5,000 years in China, and it's likely much older. So looking at how our patterns are placed on the skin and knowing that there is this correlation, it made me take a step back and think about things a little bit differently.
Yeah.
Again, who am I to go against thousands of years of wisdom? Shortly after I discovered this, I had a woman from Vancouver approach me for fertility tattoos. She had heard about me and she was 41 years old. So already considered, at least here in the States, a high-risk pregnancy. She was already perimenopausal. She did conceive, she'd miscarry. And miscarriage is a traumatic event. So she approached me. She wanted to try something holistic or natural before she went on hormone therapy, things like that. And me, armed with this new knowledge, I said, sis, I can't promise you anything. I will do the best that I can with the knowledge that I have, but we'll see what happens. So one of my apprentices and I, we flew up, we met with the woman. It's hard to explain this real concisely. I had to check her for what was active and what was not on her body energetically, just feeling for the subtle changes in the fields. And we addressed 4 different spots on her body for fertility. These were traditional placements and markings. And 2 months later, she called me up. She said, Lane, I'm pregnant.
Wow.
And if you don't know Filipinos, we like to gossip. We started telling people. For a hot minute, I was tattooing fertility marks like they were going out of style or something, wholesale
Wow.
kind of work. But the benefit of that was that we repeated it over and over again. We have several what we call batok babies. Batok is one of the terms for traditional tattooing in the Philippines, but we have several batok babies where people have come for fertility markings. We address the energetic issues through tattooing. And think about it this way. When you get acupuncture, they put a metal needle in the skin and they stimulate with the electromagnetic field of their body, or they might burn a little bit of paper on top of it to add or release energy from that spot. But when you put a black dot over that energetic point, it's just like wearing black clothing and going out in the sun. It absorbs electromagnetic radiation from the sun and stimulate point every time you're exposed to light. So it's a permanent enhancement to the body. People just thought about our tattoos from that perspective, just about tattooing in general. Think about it from that perspective. Where you mark on your body is significant to your health. That would change our practice throughout the world. Definitely would want to lean on your ancestors' wisdom, right?
That's an incredible story about the fertility and also fascinating research that you're doing, I guess, in the immune benefits of tattooing, but also through the lived experience of giving tattoos and what you've seen. Some of the words that I wrote down when you were just sharing around what the difference is between how tattooing has been approached in a cultural context, and I guess in a way how the lack of those things sustain our approach towards tattoo as art, was service. So the service piece to the community and that collective understanding, guidance and protocol. So that really moved people through receiving tattoos and giving tattoos in a way that had integrity as well. And you touched on this idea of earning the right of your tattoos. That's how tattoos were approached and are approached in a cultural context from what you just shared, which is lacking now in many cases. And then you also started sharing about these intrinsic functions of tattooing, which I'm curious to go a bit deeper into now. We're also doing some research at the Tattoo Pathway, and we're at the early stages of it now. And we've recently completed a first survey with 69 respondents. I guess we're really trying to understand at this stage, what is tattooing for people currently in a modern context, and what does it do for people in a current context? We're just really trying to get some data on that to check the pulse to inform our future movements, I guess you could say. But there were these really common motivations for getting tattooed, which piques my curiosity around, are there these intrinsic functions of tattooing? So the first was actually for the art, which is really interesting considering that's been part of our conversation already. Then the other highest, most commonly shared motivations for being tattooed was to tell my story, to mark a transformation, to be reminded of something significant and important, and to be connected and reminded of loved ones. So they were the main motivations that were coming through. And then the main reasons why people were saying that their tattoos are meaningful is because it represents their life journey or a chapter of life. That was actually a really highly shared experience. 30% of respondents were experiencing that. The other two main reasons why they were meaningful was because it connects people to their loved ones. If the tattoo had a connection to certain mythology or symbolism or religion, that made it meaningful for them. And so I'm sitting with this research at the moment. I'm in active analysis and contemplation. But some of the things that were really standing out to me as potential intrinsic functions of tattooing were the record-keeping function, the transformation it marks or can take you through, the symbology of it, and then the guidance it can give. And so I'm curious to hear from you. What do you think are the primary functions or intrinsic elements of tattooing, both within a cultural context, but available to all people getting tattooed who might not have as strong a link to a cultural context? And you touched on one then, the health boosting benefits of being tattooed, but I wondered if you had any others that you could add to that.
Well, from what you've told me about your respondents, it seems like if that was within a culture, would be a lot of the motivation for tattooing, right? So I think people maybe even instinctually understand that if they really take time to think about why they're doing certain things. Obviously, there are people who just want it for the whatever subculture they're participating in. And so people will that way. They'll go into it just trying to maybe be part of the community. Like when Harley Davidson here in the States was really popular a few years ago, everybody's getting Harley Davidson tattoos or biker style tattoos because they want to identify with that culture. So people, I think, in the Western context are still kind of searching for that community. They're searching for a unifying culture when it comes to tattooing. They're just kind of feeling their way around in the dark, in my opinion. Culture is what unifies all of that, and in a way standardizes it so that it is understandable and that the knowledge gets transmitted. Like if you don't belong to don't have a strong connection, I should say, to a culture of some sort that is a tattooing culture, I think one of the things that I would encourage people to do is to really go for it. Go for your roots. It's worth the journey to find out who you come from and who you are. All lives that have contributed to your genetically, linguistically, etc. All of that has shaped you over centuries upon this. And so if people take the time to really get to know their ancestors and why they tattooed, it'll give them a unifying context so that they can get things done in a proper way. Even for myself, I'm Norwegian and Danish descent. I looked into those cultures for significance in body marking. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of world cultures had body markings of some sort in the past. And if people take the time to look into those things, even if you're from a place that you don't think had tattoos, bet you if you dig deep enough, you're going to find it. I had 2 women here this weekend who are part Filipino and also Greek. And they did not know that the Greeks tattooed. And so I showed them a few pictures from vases from the past and old pottery from Greece. And sure enough, you see the tattoos on people. And there are people that are doing a little research into that now. And Nicole last night asked me, well, what do they mean? What is this? I said, well, you need to probably look at ancient Greek culture. For example, there are animal motifs. What animals are associated with what gods from your pantheon in the past? Not impossible. I think people sometimes get the term research. Like you have to be this hugely smart scholar to do that type of work. No, you can do your own research. If you can read and you can cruise the internet, you can do the work that you need. Now, obviously, if it's something in more recent history, definitely ask your elders, ask your family. They would have the knowledge. But yeah, it's very rewarding. I would really encourage people to really dig into their own ancestry so that when you have something from your own ancestry on your body, it's very empowering. When we do the work in my school, I think one of the biggest rewards for me as a practitioner is to see how it empowers people, how they change. It does in and of itself transform the individual. According to my teacher, Kione, he says, you're not the same person walking in as when you leave the mat. And in our tradition in the Philippines, it is quite significant in that way. Up north among the Kalinga people, they do these marks, these facial markings here on the forehead, underneath the eyes, and chin right here, sometimes on the cheeks. And those marks are called linglingao and are thought to transform the spirit of that person so that they are not the same person. And it also disguises the wearer to malevolent entities because they are now energetically or spiritually different. So sometimes those markings are the transformation themselves, and sometimes they're to honor a transformation. Those actual points on the face too are acupuncture points.
The layers that are there.
Yeah. Those ones under the eyes, that belongs to the stomach meridian. That's stomach 2 in Chinese medicine. And it also affects fertility. And those were also given to our women. So yeah, just a lot of different layers of understanding with our markings. It's not just art. It's not just a symbol of an event. There's all these different factors that go into it. And that's what we as cultural practitioners of tattooing have to navigate when a person comes in. I give people a little bit of leeway in terms of placement. If they are in a profession, for example, where they're not allowed to have visible tattoos, we'll look at alternative placements based on their cultural background. If it is a traditional placement from their ancestry, then I'm open to doing it. But I don't like doing placements as much because I like to fly in the face of thousands of years of wisdom. I'll ask them, where do you feel that this design needs to be put on your body, or where do you feel like you need to be marked and why? And then they might give me a response. And sometimes they're very intuitive. The recipients are very intuitive, and they'll say, well, I feel like I need to have my forearms or my hands done. And then I'll come in and I'll explain the cultural significance of those markings. And often it lines up with their life experience and what they need or have done. But if it isn't a traditional placement, then I am really adverse to doing it. I pick the design, I pick the placement because our ancestors have already chosen those placements and the designs for us. Now, based on a person's ethnic group from the Philippines, there's a palette of designs I could potentially choose from, but which of those is the most pertinent for that person at the time? That really depends on the ethnic group they belong to and what is needed. If I find that aligns with things culturally, then we'll move forward and we do the ritual stuff. But I often have to spend sometimes up to 3 hours educating a person when they come to receive a ceremony from me. Again, there is a lack of knowledge among our people. So when people read my book, for example, it helps me a lot to not have to explain everything that I'm explaining right now, actually.
Yes.
So that they understand what they're getting into, because some of our designs are almost contractual, like a covenant between you spirits, that they will pay more attention to you and you will pay more attention to them. So unless you're willing to make that kind of commitment and become open spiritually and establish a strong relationship with those on the other side, you're probably not getting it for the right reasons.
Yeah, I think conversations like these and your book, I really recommend people to read your book, even if you're not from a Filipino context like myself, because it does shed a lot of insight on what tattooing is and does. You know, some of the things we were just sharing now around the transformation being the right timing, linking to ancestors, the different motifs and placement having significant meaning and it needing to be right for that person. There's all these layers. And yeah, when you said that people in Western culture in relation to their tattoos are wandering in the dark, I think that's really accurate. That's my key observation and actually experience with most of my tattoos. For 10 years, I was definitely getting tattooed without any guidance or even any awareness of what I was doing. And so, yeah, having these conversations is really helpful just to at least provide a bit of a direction people can move in to start seeking that knowledge if they do wish to have more meaningful tattoos and understand how that's impacting their body, their mind, and their spirit, like you say. And I guess related to giving direction, something I read in your book that really piqued my interest was you talking about tattoos as a navigational aid. And I guess just linking that a little bit to the embeddedness in cultural context, I was so fascinated at how this insight was derived from linguistic root words. So, for example, when you were sharing in the book around burik, meaning engraved or spotted, and then the root words of that having this relationship with guidance and steering, and so how tattoos, I guess, acted as this function to support people navigate life. Could you just share a little bit more about that particular part or function of tattooing, the navigational aid component?
Yeah. So like you mentioned, the burik is one of our words for tattooing up north. Buri is the root word that means to guide, or in a literal navigational context on the canoes, the rudder usually has that term included in it, uri or uli. So how do the tattoos guide you? Like I mentioned earlier, it is a type of covenant to receive the marks. And a lot of our traditional markings are stylized representations of ancestors, often in their animal forms. And that's another large explanation, unfortunately. But it's thought that when we pass, most people go to the afterlife. But a few of those people will sometimes hang around and stick with their descendants. And that's done through a ritual. And so if you have a very powerful person in life, for lack of a better term in English, a shaman, what we call a bailan or a babailan. They would go through this ritual after death. In Filipinos, we still practice a fragment of this. We call it the death anniversary of an individual. We go to the grave, we speak to the dead, we give them offerings of their favorite foods a lot of the time. But that's a fragment of an older practice from a ritual called the bangkai ritual, which basically just means corpse ritual, where on the death anniversary, not only would they be given offerings, not only would we speak to them, but we would exhume them. And the body was cleaned of all the remaining flesh. The finer bits of flesh that we could not remove by hand, the bones would be left in front of ant hills and termite mounds. And then the termites or ants would pick the bones clean. Part of the deceased goes into that hive. And so even to this day, Filipinos, when we pass by what's called a punso or a bunton, a termite mound, we will say, "Oh, tabi po," or "bari bari apo," when we pass by them. Literally, it's kind of like "excuse me," because there's an ancestor interred in there. Spaniards came along and said, "Oh, it's a duende, it's a dwarf." That's a Spanish term, duende, a dwarf that lives in there. No, it's an ancestor's remains that are in there. But the bulk of the flesh would be packaged in fresh meat and fed to a crocodile or a large python. And so it was thought that the mana, or the essence of that individual, would permeate that animal. And now the animal is that physical manifestation of that anito or ancestor. So when we would encounter crocodiles in the past, you would address it as grandfather or grandmother. And your responsibility, like I mentioned in the book, was to still your heart and your mind, allow inspiration to come forward. It's thought that through that intuitive voice, that inner voice, the ancestors speak to us. So through your heart and your mind, you open yourself up to the spirit world, so to speak, and let that inspiration come. And then you are invited to follow that inspiration. It might be, "Taylor, go home. You left the stove on." And you go home. "Oh my God, I left the stove on." You turn it on. It was like, I listened, right?
Yeah.
And I use the example of being on the highway and feeling like I need to take the earlier exit, but maybe I ignore it. And then I hit traffic. Oh my God, if I had only listened to that inner voice, I wouldn't be late for my appointment. So we still think in terms like that. People will talk about listen to your gut, things like that. Right? What does your intuition say? So that's the ancestral voice. And so that's what happened when you encountered one of these animal forms of our ancestors, is that you would stop, address the animal as your ancestor, and then wait for them to speak to you spiritually. Now, you don't always encounter a crocodile. I hope you don't encounter crocodiles, but having the marking of a crocodile in your skin, whenever I look at my designs and I remember which ancestor that represents, not some designs are ancestors in general, and others are for specific individuals. Europeans mistakenly called gods in our tradition. It would be more analogous to spirits. But the Anito are these ancestor beings that have, through these rituals that have been largely forgotten, have been given a new form. And when they manifest themselves in the physical world through that animal form, we're encouraged to listen to their guidance. So when I look at my designs, it's a constant reminder to be spiritually aware so that I can be got the most productive paths of life. If I ignore that counsel, I get lost. So that's how, people say, we're all want tattoos because they think of it in terms of just magic. That, if I get this design, I'm going to be protected. I get that a lot. I'll get people, I feel like I need more emotional protection, or I need physical protection. And I have to tell them, it's not going to stop a bullet. These markings in my skin are not going to stop a bullet. What protects me is being in tune so that I'm guided out of that harm before it even happens. the tattoo itself is not magical. It's the relationship that the tattoo represents that
Yeah.
protects. So that's where the guidance comes from.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And I guess it leads me to another question. Do you think tattoos that might not be explicitly linked with an ancestor, but that have been approached in a way with intention, mind, body, heart, coherence, and I guess in connection with a greater power, and just acknowledging that that looks different for different people? So I'm just using a bit more of a generic term. Do you think tattoos that are approached in that way can still have the relationship that gives guidance to walk through life in a good and true way?
Oh, definitely. I definitely do. If you get something that acknowledges a higher power, or, like you mentioned earlier with your surveys, people associate it with transformation. It's a reminder of that transformation, for example, a reminder that you have come into a new way of being. Everybody gets lost occasionally. Everyone goes through little traumas or big traumas. And sometimes we need those constant reminders in our life of what we have gone through and that we've overcome things. The Philippines, sometimes in our medicine ways, for example, among the Ifugao people of Luzon, when they do a ritual, a healing ritual, they first engage the placebo effect. And what they'll do is they'll tell a story of an ancestor and their accomplishments. And they'll tell this whole story. The Mumbakis will tell this whole story about a particular ancestor. It might be Lumawig is a favorite character in these stories. Lumawig in Polynesia is Maui. Polynesians tend to shorten what we have in Philippines. Our words, or their words, are sometimes shorter than ours. But the stories of Lumawig are commonly told in these rituals. And they will tell you at the end of it, after they tell the whole story of Lumawig accomplishing this great task or healing from this disease, they will tell the whole story again with the recipient's name in the Maui. And they will say at the end, just as your ancestor did this, so you will do this. You have been mythed. You have become the myth. So does is it gets the person to shift from being in a place of victimization by their disease, for example, if it's disease, into a place of empowerment where they can visualize overcoming it. So we start with the placebo effect, and then all subsequent treatment after that, medicinal or otherwise, is a lot more effective. And the tattoos of transformation also are kind of like that constant reminder, because a lot of our designs are associated with oral tradition. Marks that I have on my arm are references.
Wow.
These were done by my tattoo brother, Kili'i Makua, in Hawaii. And these are Filipino designs, not Hawaiian designs. So brother was stressed doing these because he'd never. But this is common. This design right through here, we both among Hawaiians and Filipinos. For us, this is what we call a kilat or a kimat design, a lightning pattern. Lightning is used for navigation and is associated with a particular deity, as well as this solar motif here and the moon pattern within it. So this part with the strikes through it is the moon eclipsing the sun. And in the horizon, which is where, when you're navigating on the ocean, that's where you're going to take direction. Is when the sun or the moon are directly over the horizon. That's where you're going to get a really good sense of east and west. And both of these, the sun and the moon, are tied to specific ancestors. They go back to my genealogy and my ancestors by name. So there's an association with them. So every time I look at my arm, I think about my ancestors that navigated in the past and when they took direction and their wisdom and the stories of those ancestors. It helps guide my life, guide me in productive paths. And just having that idea of you have been mythed, You are your ancestors is encouraging. It is empowering. If they did it and me as their descendant, I can do it. It raises your overall confidence. And I know a lot of people can relate to this. And once they receive that tattoo, even if it's a Western style tattoo, feel different, right?
Yeah, I can relate to that also. And I think the transformational aspect of tattooing and the navigational component of tattooing are these potentially inherent functions of tattooing that people can connect to that will support them have more meaningful tattoo experiences and I guess experience those positive emotions you were talking about, empowerment, clarity on direction, reminder. And I think that's really needed because tattoo regret is actually something really big in Western culture. That was actually another area of my research. And from our survey, we gauged that about 56% of people had experienced tattoo regret at some stage, whether that be the design, the placement didn't match expectations. And then I also went on to Reddit and did an analysis of the top 50 posts of the tattoo advice forum. There's about 303,000 members on that. And yet again, there were these rude experiences of tattoo regret and distress and anxiety and, about the design and placement and choices they were making. And so I think the more that we can really connect to these transformational aspects of tattooing and navigational aspects, it can support people on the path of more meaningful tattoos. Thanks everyone to those who listened in. I hope you enjoyed today's episode and connected to some of Lane's guidance and wisdom on approaching tattoos in a more meaningful and substantial way. I definitely learned a lot from this conversation. Thank you, Lane. As I shared at the beginning of this episode, we'll be releasing a part 2 to this conversation soon. Links to Lane's social media and website are in the show notes. Thanks all for now. I'll see you next time.